was 9 years old the first time I realized that my name could be a problem, not because I had done anything wrong, but because it belonged to me, because it was attached to my skin. My mother named me after her grandfather, a man who had built houses with his own 2 hands, who had worked from sunrise to sunset to provide for a family that the world never saw as enough. She told me my name meant strength, but the first time I saw a teacher pause while reading attendance, the first time I saw the way her lips hesitated before she said it, I understood that, to some people, my name meant trouble. By the time I was in middle school, I had already learned how to soften it, how to say it quickly so it didn't linger, how to let teachers mispronounce it so they wouldn't roll their eyes when I corrected them, how to pretend I didn't notice when kids laughed at it in the hallway, when they twisted it into something it wasn't. My mother would tell me not to let it bother me, would say they only did it because they were small and I was big. But when you're 12 and sitting in a classroom where no one looks like you, when you're the only black kid in the advanced classes, when you hear the way they say your name like it doesn't belong to you, like it's too heavy for them to carry, you start to believe that maybe you are the problem. I stopped correcting people. I let them call me whatever they wanted. My father noticed. He said, "A name is more than what they call you. It's who you are. Don't let them take that from you." I didn't know how to tell him that I wasn't trying to give it away, that I just wanted to make things easier, that I just wanted to fit. But even then, I think he knew. The first time I understood what my name really meant was in high school. I was applying for a summer program, a competitive one, the kind that looked good on college applications. My grades were perfect, my essay was strong, my teachers wrote glowing recommendations. I was sure I would get in. Then I saw the list of names of the students who had been accepted. My name wasn't on it. At first I thought maybe I just wasn't good enough, maybe there were others who deserved it more, but then I heard my counselor whispering outside her office, talking about how I should have gotten in, about how my application was better than some of the students who had, but how sometimes these things just happened. I sat there staring at my hands, at the name written at the top of my application, and I wondered if that was all it took. If my name was the reason I wasn't enough. My father didn't say "I told you so" when I told him. He didn't say anything at all. He just nodded like he had expected it, like it wasn't new to him, like it wasn't new to any of us. I went to college thinking that maybe things would be different, that maybe in a bigger city, in a bigger world, my name wouldn't be something that held me back, that maybe I wouldn't have to shrink myself just to be let in. But the first time I sent out resumes, the first time I applied for internships and got no response, the first time I overheard someone say they couldn't even pronounce half the names on the list, I realized that some things don't change. I thought about changing it, about using my middle name instead, about making things easier, but I couldn't, not after everything, not after the way my father had looked at me that day, not after all the times he told me that I had to take up space, even when they tried to erase me. So I kept sending out applications. I kept introducing myself with my full name. I kept making sure they heard me, even when they pretended not to. Eventually I got a job at a firm, not because they wanted me, but because I didn't give them a choice. Because I made sure my work spoke louder than their biases, because I refused to let them decide who I was. But even then, even with a degree, with an office, with a title, it didn't stop. I sat in meetings where my name was always the one mispronounced, where clients would shake hands with my white colleagues first, even when I was the one in charge. I answered emails from people who assumed I was someone else until they met me in person and saw the truth. I watched as job candidates with names that sounded more familiar got interviews, while others like mine were tossed aside before they were even read. One day a colleague asked me if I had ever thought about shortening it, if I had ever considered making it easier for people to say. I smiled and told him that my name wasn't the problem, that maybe they just needed to try harder. When my son was born, I gave him a name that carried history, that carried weight, that carried the stories of the people who came before him. And when he came home from school one day and asked why his teacher never said it right, I knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and told him what my father told me. A name is more than what they call you, it's who you are. Don't let them take that from you. I thought that once I had a career, once I had made a name for myself, once I had built something solid, that I would stop feeling like I had to prove my own existence. That my name would no longer be a burden. That I would walk into rooms and not have to brace myself for the moment of hesitation, for the moment they saw me and realized I was not what they expected. But the thing about names, about history, about identity is that no matter how much you achieve, no matter how much you prove yourself to the world will still find ways to remind you that you do not belong. It started with an email, a simple request from HR asking if I could meet with a potential client for lunch. The kind of thing that was normal in my line of work. I was good at what I did. I had won cases that others said were unwinnable. I had fought for people who had been buried under systems designed to erase them. So I agreed, set the date, made the reservation, arrived 10 minutes early to show that I took it seriously. I recognized him the moment he walked in, white, mid-50s, the kind of man who had spent his whole life in boardrooms making decisions that never touched him. I stood, extended my hand, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice, then shook it briefly before sitting down. We ordered small talk at first, business pleasantries, but then his expression changed slightly, a shift so subtle most people wouldn't have caught it. "I have to admit," he said, stirring his drink, "I wasn't expecting someone like you." I already knew what he meant, but I let him keep talking. "Where I saw your name, I just assumed." "Oh, you know." He laughed like we were sharing a joke. I smiled back, tight controlled, but inside I felt it. The familiar weight pressing down. The reminder that no matter how many degrees I had, no matter how many cases I won, I would always be a surprise, an anomaly. I finished the meeting as professionally as I could, but when I got back to my office, there was an email waiting for me from HR, thanking me for my time, but letting me know the client had decided to go in a different direction. I stared at the screen at the words carefully chosen to say nothing and everything all at once. That night I went home, poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table thinking about my father, thinking about the way he held himself together in the face of a world that refused to see him, thinking about all the times he told me to stand tall even when they tried to cut me down. I thought about my son, how one day he would grow into his name the way I had. How he would carry it into rooms where people would hesitate before shaking his hand, how he would learn to recognize the weight of silence the way I had. A few weeks later, I was asked to speak at a diversity panel, the kind that corporations hold to make themselves feel better. I sat on a stage with 4 others, all of us there to talk about how far we had come, all of us there to tell the audience that things were changing, that progress was real and tangible. But when the moderator turned to me and asked if I had ever faced obstacles because of my background, because of my name, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't know how else to answer. I could have told them about the college applications that went unanswered, about the job interviews where my resume had impressed them until they saw me, about the business meetings where my name was too much of a mouthful for them to bother saying correctly. I could have told them about the times I had been followed in stores, the times I had been stopped in my own neighborhood, the times I had watched people tense up the moment they saw me. Instead, I said what my father had told me all those years ago. A name is more than what they call you, it's who you are. And for the first time in my life, I let myself believe it. I thought that after everything, after the degrees, after the career, after proving myself again and again the way my father had, I would finally be done carrying this weight, that I would no longer have to walk into a room and calculate my presence in real time, that I would no longer have to anticipate the hesitation, the sideways glances, the pause before they said my name, like it was something difficult, like it didn't belong. But life has a way of reminding you that no matter how much space you take up, the world will still find ways to shrink you. It started with my son. He was in 3rd grade the first time it happened, really happened. I had seen the small things before, the microaggressions disguised as curiosity, the mispronunciations, the way teachers would comment on how well-spoken he was, like it was some kind of miracle. But this was different. He came home quiet, too quiet. I knew that silence. It was the same silence my father carried, the same silence I had learned to live inside. I asked him what was wrong, and at first he shook his head, but I could see it in his eyes, in the way he avoided looking at me. Finally he said it. They made fun of my name. My chest tightened, but I kept my face calm because I knew I had to, because if I showed how much it hurt him, it would only hurt him more. I asked him what happened. He told me that during roll call his teacher had stumbled over his name again, the same way she had been stumbling over it all year, even though we had corrected her a dozen times. He told me that when she finally gave up and asked if she could call him something easier, the whole class laughed. He told me that when he tried to correct her, she just smiled and said, "It wasn't a big deal, that it was just a name. Just a name." I felt my fingers curl into a fist under the table, but I forced myself to breathe. That night I sat with him on his bed, ran my hand over his curls and told him what my father had told me all those years ago. A name is more than what they call you. It's who you are. Don't let them take that from you. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it, not yet. The next morning I walked him to school instead of dropping him off. I walked into that classroom, stood in front of that teacher and made sure she said his name right. I made sure she understood that it wasn't just a name. It was history. It was lineage. It was identity. It was his. She nodded, smiled, apologized, but I saw the way she looked at me, the same way they always did, like I was being difficult, like I was making something out of nothing, like my son should just learn to accept that the world would never bother to learn who he was. That night, I sat at my desk staring at an empty document, the weight of everything pressing down on me again. So I wrote. I wrote about the way names are erased before voices ever get the chance to be heard. I wrote about the way the world decides which names are normal and which ones are too much. I wrote about my father, about my son, about every time I had swallowed the discomfort to make things easier for them, because I thought that was survival, because I thought that was the only way. And then I sent it to my editor. It ran the next morning. By noon, my inbox was full of responses. Some were from people who understood, from people who had lived it, from people who carried their own names like burdens instead of like banners. But some were not. Some told me I was overreacting, that it was just a name, that it didn't mean anything, that people had their names mispronounced all the time and it wasn't a big deal. Just a name. Just a name. A week later, my son came home smiling for the first time since it happened. My teacher said my name right today, he said. I nodded, because she finally listened, and I wondered how many more times we would have to make them listen before they finally understood.